Welcome to the CEFACT Global Trust Registry project. This is in Australia, the 8th of August, nice and palindromic, 8th of the 8th. This is the second meeting in this sort of 2 weekly meeting sets that we have. We have these meetings sort of every 2 weeks. And about 17 hours ago, we had the earlier meeting, which includes predominantly people from Europe and Australia as well. We had probably about 15 people, I think, in total yesterday in the discussion. I'd like to welcome you all. The session is being recorded, the transcript will be generated and minutes will be published. And if you decide to put chat messages in, that's great. We don't record people's names or their presence unless they decide to do so. So if you put it in the chat, it'll be there. And if you wish, you can remain quiet and then nothing will be known of your presence, more or less, I think. Okay, let's move on to the business of the day. So a couple of things about code of conduct and IPR. So under CEFACT rules, the work that we do on these projects is considered to be of open source kind of standard nature, so that contributions are royalty free, provided to the general good, and published to be used, or recommendations are published for countries to take note of. Those of you who've already applied to be a CEFACT expert, brilliant, thank you, well done. If you haven't yet received a response, don't worry, the application we are treating as a recognition of intellectual property acceptance and the rules. Otherwise, I think generally speaking for these meetings, I just want to encourage everyone to participate, irrespective of whether you've had a CEFACT tap on the shoulder or not. I think it's good to have a good conversation about the topics we want to work through today. Those topics are, so there's just 2 items on the agenda. They'll kind of work towards each other, actually. One is a little bit of sort of project admin, but it'll help you, if you haven't seen it before, understand some of the prior work that's been done on another CEFACT project called the UNTP, United Nations Transparency Protocol project. So that created some a body of thinking around a concept they call the digital identity anchor. And that body of thinking is the kind of catalyst for the work that's now being adopted within this project, the Global Trust Registry project. So we're developing some of the thinking that UNTP started. We're taking responsibility for that development, so it becomes a spec underneath this project. And we're also developing a thing, the sort of trust registry concept, which we prefer to consider as a kind of like a directory or a list of. So we're not actually going to collect the world's trust together and put it in a registry or anything bizarre. The project name has caused a little bit of confusion, but the concept is that we'll create a kind of registry of authoritative registrars that do things to do with supply chains, and that we'll have a digital identity anchor recommendation as well. So those are the 2 kind of concepts. I want to explain a bit about how Steve and I discussed last night to move the work that exists into this project. And then we're going to talk about the really interesting stuff. Not that it isn't interesting, by the way, but the glyph and how that might work with what we're looking at. So last night we had 1 or 2 representatives from glyph. One of them in particular was quite active. Even Marin was on the call from glyph. And that was great because it let us have a really good conversation about what it does and check that our understanding was correct and what the opportunities are. So where we got to last night was when we got to this slide. Steve managed to sort of explain from his perspective kind of what happened and what's been going on with the UNTP project and what led us to here. I can do that not in the same style as Steve, but I can at least give you a sort of sense of where we've come from. So this is a web page representation of the UNTP project's work. It's currently being moved into a GitLab environment. It wasn't a GitHub environment, and it's sort of halfway between the shift. But this is the sort of content that described the digital identity anchor inside the spec of UNTP. So Marcus has already looked at this content and actually extracted it and written some comments on it, sort of as a Word document. And Marcus has actually illustrated the need we have to work out how to take the content you're seeing on the screen now, provide comments and updates and improvements to that content, but make it our content in our space, in our project space. So what's happening is we're going to take effectively this is like markdown pages and other content that's part of that what's GitHub and now GitLab environment. we're now moving into a GitLab environment. That's where I've just moved to now, under the United Nations kind of computing center. So there's some infrastructure that the United Nations run on computing environments. That's under the UNICC group, and under that, they've now created a sort of UNECE, which is the body. The UN it has a lot of layers to it, but the UN CEFACT, which is a global CEFACT bureau for trade and commerce, is underneath the European arm of the United Nations, but not because Europe has a precedence or anything else. It just has to be underneath an arm, so it's underneath that. But UN CEFACT has this body of projects already. So we've got the Global Trust Registry, UNTP. We will have verifiable trade documents is another project being spun up, and they've already got this low code initiative, which, if you're familiar with it, is this idea about identifiers for locations for trade. So where is that plant? Where is that distribution center? Where is that port? That sort of content. That's what low code does. So we're moving content from the GitHub as was of UNTP into the GitLab as is for our project, and we're going to take your comments, Marcos, and others on the digital identity anchor and manage them within our space here. Now that space is 36 hours old now, and I haven't yet populated it. Sorry, but it's got a whole bunch of stuff that I need to pull into here. And where our content is at the moment is these documents that we have. So if I go into this place here, we have a bunch of deliverables that we're working on. And my hypothesis is, for most of us, it's easier to edit a document in a collaborative space than to do a fork, pull request, and other sorts of activities that you do in a Git environment. So I'm happy to stay with this sort of type of document share and collaboration until such time as we feel we can usefully transfer into the Git environment. We don't need to sort of burden ourselves with learning more things if we don't need to. So as an example of a piece of work that will become relevant in this discussion, this document was mostly produced by Alina Nikagala. She's a lawyer. She's also the registrar for land assets in Spain. The Registradores organization is her employer. And she drafted a number of constraints, ideas, entry criteria for registrars to be recognized in this idea of a United Nations UN CEFACT list of registrars. So the fundamental building blocks of the United Nations are, of course, countries, nation-state countries. That's what its sort of fundamental building block is. So it's interested in things that are to do with United Nations, nation-states. And so one of the criteria that Lena elaborates here is that you need to be an authoritative registrar recognized in a nation state as the registrar of something to do with supply chains. So organizations, land, trademarks, other things like that. That was drawn up a little while ago. And that then, in a sense, took us into the next part of this discussion. So for digital identity anchors and what they mean and how they work, we'll go back to that probably in 2 weeks' time. We've got some prior work explaining how they work in this deck that I'm sharing with you now that's available to all of you. And we're going to be expanding on it because it's going to be another part of the puzzle. So the part of the puzzle I want to look at now is more to do with who gets into this list of registered authorities and how do we work with organizations like GLIFE. So GLIFE isn't the only thing of interest. We have on our call, of course, somebody who's looking after the IRA Foundation and the work that's going there. So there are a number of global initiatives of significant interest for how we might be able to sort of trust fabrics and trust ecosystems. We've got a very narrow focus here on trade and supply chains because that's the UN CEFACT kind of lens. But nevertheless, all of these are potentially very useful parts to the puzzle about how you get confidence about another participant in the supply chain. GLIFE is a very useful example to work through because of a number of factors. It's established. It's got a significant sort of body behind it. The G20 under its Financial Stability Board kind of created the GLIFE, Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation. It's got quite a large number of organizations already registered with it. And it's been recently accepted or chosen by the European Banking Authority as a requirement in banking in Europe to have an LEI, legal entity identifier, as an organization. So it's got a bunch of reasons why it's sort of interesting. And let's look at it in more detail. Now, that's a scary looking image, I suggest, that I've just put up on the screen. It's got quite a lot of detail to it. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is build up that detail. So very simply, we're talking about an organization that wants to register with or create itself. So wants to be, so Joe and I are on the call. We're a tiny organization called CESU. Who says we're CESU? Well, ASIC, the Australian Registrar of Companies, has an entry in it for CESU, and we have an Australian business number because we've now registered with ASIC. There's a process to go through to register. You apply, you give bona fides, you give your details, and a bunch of other things. They decide whether you can be a registered company. So you go through this process, they check your application, assuming you accepted, they enter you into some database. So we're in the ASIC database. And then you've got to maintain this stuff, right? So we have to maintain the accuracy of our records. We're legally bound under the jurisdiction of Australia to keep the records up to date. And the record keeper, the authoritative registrar, likely also has requirements under law to check that companies aren't doing the wrong thing and don't deserve to be sort of removed from the list or whatever else. So there's a sort of mutual process of keeping data current that is under existing laws, and those laws will be somewhat similar but somewhat different from one country to another. So the registrars and the registration process will differ. A company might decide that it wants an LEI. It might need to have one to trade in Europe. It might need to have one for other reasons. There's a number of reasons why organizations might want to have an LEI. To do so, they need to apply to a local operating unit. A local operating unit is another organization separate to GLIFE. The GLIFE has certified as a proper, right and proper organization to issue LEIs. So there's a whole bunch of governance around how GLIFE works. There's a regulatory oversight committee and other bunch of things. But basically, they've written rules, governance framework, very quite detailed governance framework around the processes and the participants. So an LOU can apply, or an organization can apply to be an LOU for a jurisdiction. So not all LOUs can issue LEIs for all jurisdictions. There are about 5 LOUs that can issue LEIs for Australia. Some of them are kind of multinational. So Bloomberg can issue LEIs for a whole bunch of places around the world. Just focusing on the LOU bit, you do a request to the LOU. They check the details and they check them against the authoritative registrar. They either make a request to them, some sort of direct request to them, or they check the data if it's a verifiable data source. And they make these checks. And if they decide you are right and proper, they issue you with an LEI. And they need then to tell the local, the GLIFE Foundation, the GLIFE, that's a double up, they need to tell GLIFE that they've registered a new organization. And that has entries into this index I'm showing on the right hand side here, the global LEI index, which you can look up. So these URLs work if you could see them, but the URLs will work on the slides and take you to the LEI index search. You can look up companies and so on. GLIFE has a very particular lens on organizations. One of the things it's really interested in is not only who is who, but also who owns who. So GLIFE's raison d'etre is to help reduce financial crime, anti-money laundering, all sorts of other sort of issues. And one of the things you need to know is who's the ultimate beneficiary of a transaction. And therefore, they're interested in the who owns who kind of construct, which is perhaps above and beyond what an authoritative national business registry might be interested in. They may or may not be interested in the global interests of this company. It's up to them as to how far and deep they go. But GLIFE has that interest. GLIFE also maintains this registration authorities list. It's like a side effect of their registration process. They are told by LOUs, we're registering this company and they're registered with this authority. And so GLIFE maintains a list of this authorities. Okay, so it's got a registration list. And that's an area I'm going to go back to because I think it's an area of shared interest and potential additional value. Any questions? I'll stop talking for a second just to let anybody ask a question if you have one.
John, I do have a quick question, a little side topic that is, Are these meetings being called and uploaded to some repository or getting like scripted? Because, for example, I think that as I because of the time zone cannot attend like to yesterday's calls, I think it would be very useful to be able to review them like entirely or through a script. So I don't know if that's possible.
It is absolutely possible, Marcus. They are all recorded. They're in a meetings folder. So you'll find in the meetings folder, it's publicly accessible and viewable, the transcripts, the recordings, the chat messages, and the meeting minutes generated by Gemini. So they're all there. Mark, you've got your hand up twice, I think. Oh, no, you're the second person, sorry.
Yeah, Paul's got his hand up first.
Yeah, Paul, can you go first? Sorry, I've misread my numbers.
No problem. I'm keen to understand, how do you see this going in terms of, are we just focusing on trade, or are we potentially, and the name, digital identity anchor implies digital identity focus as well, because
it's a great question.
My concept, I suppose, I'm coming from is that at the moment, the Australian government, UN through ITU with digital wallets, are talking about what trust registries are and what particularly organisation identities are, and they're all trying to work out what an organisation identity is, how they work that in.
So it's a great question, right? So there's at least two parts. There's probably way more than two. Joe will always tell me there's always three, and I just need to think of the third by the time I get there. But of the two that I can immediately think of, one is the identities we're initially interested in are those that are kind of the atomic entities of the supply chain transactions. So organizations and lands, parcels of land, and planes and trains, automobiles, and trademarks and so on. But that's a sort of simplification that's necessary. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to sort of make progress. So we've got to simplify to that. Inevitably, the interest becomes at some point in time what persons are responsible for this organization, who are the directors of this company, and so on. And that's a legitimate question, necessary question in many instances. And we all probably know on this call that there are significant efforts in that space, and they're very aligned with similar efforts in identity of people in general. And there's a very good project I encourage you to have a look at if you want to, the First Persons project that's being spun off of a very interesting academic paper from last year, and a number of other initiatives. So we're not going to go there in this project in this time frame. We've got until like the end of this calendar year to get our act together on recommendations, and those are significantly complex, necessary, and interesting spaces to go to, but it's going to be like too much. So I'm going to focus really on the first order of magnitude of identification in this phase. And then the next thing is, my working idea at the moment is we need to be like a wrapper around existing identifier models for the DIA. That rather than say there is only one identifier and this is the identifier, which is a bit draconian and unlikely to work, we need to recognize there are lots of identifiers. There's the GS1, GLN, GTIN, there's the Glyph, LEIs, there's Dun and Bradstreet's Duns. There's a whole bunch of identifiers that might be useful for trade purposes or legal reasons, and we can't constrain or mandate their use. So we're probably going to have a sort of an open approach to how we want identifiers to be verifiable, and we want the verification process to also enable, and do they come from an authoritative source? And that's kind of what we're aiming for.
So if I maybe ask another question just to follow up on that for clarification, if we're talking, and I'll use ASIC, apologies for international folk on the call, but ASIC's the Australian Business Register. If they're issuing a verifiable credential for an organisation, would you envisage that that credential only be useful for trade purposes, or would you envisage it be reusable for other sectors? I suppose is the crux of my question.
I guess my ambitions ambition is to get through this project and do a reasonable job of it. But no, the ambition for the project is that if others choose to make use of what we've created, then brilliant. That's a good thing, right? But we're not going to recommend that our approach is adopted by the world or something. It's sort of let the most useful win is the kind of approach that I'm taking. And what I think we adopt in our earlier calls, meetings, we kind of suggested that if there was a registry, let's call it a directory, if there was a directory of authoritative registrars, in other words, you would know who registers companies in Estonia, who registers land in Brazil. If you had such a directory, then that would be a useful thing in its own right, because it would let you determine whether the claims being made by a participant that they are using land in Brazil and here's the land parcel would let you check at least through an authoritative process whether or not that can be true. So the directory itself is going to be useful. The application in the digital identity anchor role with the UNTP, that's going to sort of massively amplify the use, because it lets us become potentially kind of machine executable, verifiable, much less friction, and a very good thing. But it's a sort of it's another step, if you like. Mark, you had your hand up and it went down again. Did I talk for too long?
No. I just want to just basically say that, in my opinion, for example, we are doing government IDs in Latin America, and I think that if a good base for a trust registry standard for a list of lists is developed, I don't think there's anything preventing other use cases from using it. So even if the focus here is more on like supply chain and trade use cases, I think this can be used for many other things, which we have discussed in the past, and I just wanted to share that opinion. I don't think this is exclusive to that.
Yeah, I agree. Mark Lazar.
Good evening. So so many things, but I think in the context of what you were presenting, I was curious as to why you were presenting. What's the scope of GLEAF? And what's the role, or is that what we're exploring? So
that's exactly what we're going to get to, Mark. It's like, why am I explaining GLIFE when we're talking about the Global Trust Registry? It's partly because I think we need to, one of the ideas, ethos, I suppose, of this project is there's sort of three parts to what we're trying to do. One is to understand what exists. The second part is to understand how to represent what exists. So how do we recognize it? How do we represent it? And this third thing is about how do we make it kind of work in a sort of operational sense. This is where the pilots come into play. So this is really about step one, understanding what exists, and getting into that step two about, okay, how do we recognize it then?
So, I mean, that's super exciting for me, because I've been sort of working on this little area for quite a while, and I've actually proposed an international registry, but for transparency, for surveillance and privacy conformance in law, most importantly. So there's already like privacy regulations in law that define how identification and surveillance should be governed. So that's really mature law. Anyway, so there's existing infrastructure that I've learned about through my research and studies that this really mimics. And what is really critical for we've been looking at is enabled like digital consent to scale online. So instead of the individual being identified per second, like with Google and Facebook and that sort of thing, it's actually the company or the controller identification that's identified per second. And by doing it that way, people can actually operate with higher assurance online, but also be anonymous to the service provider, imitating physical privacy and consent sort of, but online. So we've been working on that for a really long time. And part of where we've gotten to really, which is quite, I wonder if it's coincidental, I think it is something called an anchor specification as well. specifically for this, which uses a notice record and a receipt as the envelope. So effectively, a cookie online is actually a digital receipt that has an identifier in it that requires permission and consent for all contexts for humans. It doesn't matter. It's like a universal requirement for a human to know what's going on. They need to know, there's a notice of some sort. And for that to scale online, there needs to be a record of that notice being read by that human. So, this is like been a classic sort of architecture challenge for a long time, and understanding why it is the way it is now and how to update it has been a focus for quite a while. So it's really interesting because it's, the overlap on, the fact that you come up with Anchor as a wrapper, which is exactly what we've come up with. I wonder if is it inspired, or is it?
I have not. I wish I was the person who authored the came up with that term anchor in this context. I'm not. I kind of came into the UNTP project when the words digital identity anchor were already being used. I think. I'm familiar with it to some extent, and I've got a lot of respect for the work you've done, Mark. So I think I'd love us to learn from the thinkings that you and the others had already done in that space. That's the whole intent. The specific focus on the supply chain makes our concerns about consent and privacy somewhat different initially. So if I take that first simplification I offered, that I'm initially only going to think about organizational IDs and land parcel ID, and I'm not going to be worried about the people, right? So that's right. That's a gross simplification, right? But it's actually still leaves some very interesting spaces to explore that have some similar qualities, like selective disclosure, like commercial confidentiality, like so the rights of a company to not allow another company to know some stuff because it's considered to be commercially competitive, sensitive information. So in the UNTP project, they're considering this idea of selective disclosure of things. So the fundamental currency for trade in UNTP is a digital product passport. So this idea of and that has a bunch of information that is declared by the issuer of this thing, and it could be used by others. But the question is, how much should a supplier disclose to their customer? And one of the tensions is, do I disclose my suppliers? I might get disintermediated. My customer might do a direct deal. So there's a whole bunch of very interesting tensions to solve and abilities to create. But I guess for the audience, the type of challenge UNTP and this project want to help solve are things like Scope 3 declarations of companies. What's the total carbon footprint impact of my business on the world? And to know that the answer to this question, I need to know about all the other parties that are upstream from me in the supply chain and what their impact is. So their ambition is fabulous. It's huge. It's also the same type of interest that you would have if you were keen to impose tariffs on products from certain countries. You'd like to know whether they've come from those countries at some point in time. So this idea of transparency, but also selective disclosure, there's some very interesting tensions at play in the thinking in the UNTP project. What this project will do is kind of focus narrowly on okay, what are the authoritative sources of things? Okay, the registrar, the directory, and then secondly, how might identity anchors be transferred around? And that's the sort of the next part. Probably in 2 weeks' time, I hope that will be the focus of the conversation.
Well, that's so Dick, if I could just follow up on that. So the original work we did was with the Information Commissioner in the UK on their controller registry. So in 1998, they did something quite magical, I think, which is actually make a controller registry. So we worked with that for a couple of years to look at how do you fix that or extend it. But it's really sort of the foundation of that. So when you look at Gleef, we looked at Gleef as the ability to provide assurance to that authoritative registry. And who we work with is Open Corporates, which has all the parent information and is open and free to access instead of Gleef. But if we were to want to provide assurance, then we would recommend Gleef. if you needed a higher level of assurance than that, but it's only, I believe, only covers a certain couple of vectors of assurance.
That's it.
And that's basically what, is sort of really important to see, but it's also, we're really considerate, and the reason why we've gone through all that is because we use controller identification as the way to do transparency consent and to manage and to actually govern digital identification technologies. So what you're doing with the controller registry or you're calling it an organizational registry, but there are a certain set of legal requirements that are open, free, and public that are required to legally be public for a controller to process personal information online. And those requirements are actually the only consistent requirements across all legal jurisdictions in the world. So there's only a very set, after you boil the ocean on this, there's only a certain set. And, if you use ISO and the International Interoperability Standard, which is 29100, which is also open and free to access as the framework for the semantic vocabulary, then you now actually have that set of, or that foundation already running in line with Convention 108 Plus, which is the International Privacy Treaty for the Commonwealth, which was just ratified in March. So you now have like the legal international requirements that are authoritative and an international standard and framework, as well as the required controller identification elements that are like basically a public asset. And those are the ones I think you guys are hunting for, and why you're trying to, so interested in working with Gleef, and supporting, Gleef is mutually supportive in lots of ways. But it's definitely on the identification process. Anyways, I'll just stop here. But the point really is, if you want to do consent for people that's safe, then they're anonymous online, but you need the controller identification, and you need authorization and authentication to be accessible, for those controllers to verify and authenticate people. So there is a natural structure already there for this, and it's really, exciting that you guys are really close to that already.
So thank you. There's so much that we can cover. We kind of want to move on and focus. The reason I'm talking about Glyph, remember, is it's an example. It's not the template. It's not the blueprint. It's not the anything else. It's an example of an existing system that we kind of should pay attention to, and I'm showing how we might pay attention to it. So if I find my cursor again, there's this slide you don't need to pay too much attention to, but obviously Glyph publishes in quite some detail its governance and details about its technical sort of approaches and so on. This is the LEI structure. You notice it's prefixed by an LOU identifier, so who issued the LEI is in the LEI itself. That's very similar to the GS1 GLN structure. So GS1, if you register with GS1 as a company, you get a company prefix allocated to you. But within GS1, there's a quite different governance approach that the company now can issue its own location identifiers under that company prefix. So there's a very different approach to thinking about allocation of identifiers and other things inside GS1. That's kind of one of the be careful there kind of comments to make around equivalency or differences between these sort of systems. The other thing about Glyph is that there's a very interesting bit of technology that they're using for their verifiable legal entity identifier. And it's not just interesting from a technology point of view, it's interesting from a governance point of view, and it's another area that we can talk about later. These are the questions we discussed last night after we went through the same sort of slides we've been through in my time this morning. I've got some notes from last night's discussion that I think are reasonably representative. Joe was in on the call last night and can probably sort of steer me if I've misrepresent stuff. But as to Marcus's question earlier, the recording is available and the transcript and everything else. So what areas of shared interest do we have with Glyph? Well, there's a whole number of them, right? They're not unique necessarily between Glyph and this project. But the first is probably this idea of a registration authorities, that list that in the top right hand corner of this slide here, the registration authorities list. My hypothesis is that if we create, as this project recommends, a UN CEFACT hosted list of registration authorities that the nation states of the United Nations enter themselves. In other words, they promote I register land in Spain using registradores. I register companies in New Zealand using whatever they use, DIA or something, and so on. That could be a very useful cross-check for companies, organizations like Glyph, to cross-check their data. So it could be an independent source of verified authorities. It could also be one that they collaborate with and they make use of in a more direct way. But there's possibly value in having independence about the checks, so that you've got a kind of concept of checking to see whether your homeworks add up to the same number. So that's one idea. Inevitably, we're going to be talking with them as part of the discussion, and others, about identifiers and structures. So GS1, the others I've mentioned, will be part of this discussion. How do we manage the digital identity anchor data structure and concept? That's going to be a live discussion and sort of shared interest. On question 2, if I make it so bold, no. Glyph is not an authoritative register. And the reason for that is that they are not a legally sort of bound by a sovereign nation state to be the registrar for that state, right? So there's a very important difference, and I can maybe show you on a slide that I've did since yesterday. So think of it this way: that in a country has a set of laws that it decides. It's its sovereign right and capability to decide what laws to write and what to uphold and so on. And within that country, they may recognize we're going to register businesses. We're going to recognize a type of thing called a business. We're going to give that its own legal definition, and we're going to have a registrar of that thing, right? So this is all literally made up. I don't mean that in a bad way, but I mean, we literally make this stuff up, and they have the right to decide how to make it up. Now, Glyph is another operating entity. It happens to be based in Switzerland, under whose jurisdiction it effectively operates as an organization, but it has no legal authority over any other part of the world. It has no right to register a business in Spain. It doesn't have a legal right in the sense of Spain recognizing its authority as the registrar for Spain. So there's a sort of separation of duties here. Glyph has a very particular interest in a number of things that add significant value to trade, and it's a good thing to have Glyph around, but it's a different kind of thing to the authoritative registrar. So if I go back to this list, it is Glyph an authoritative registrar? Not in our terms. It's not a nation state, and it's not a nation state legislative sort of body. So it doesn't. If we had,
yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, yeah.
John, I'm just wondering, do we have the terminology? I agree that depending on how you look at it, they're not authoritative. I would argue they are authoritative in their own domains. The question in my mind is, do you have another term that says the non-authoritative? There's not a one inflammatory term, because that's going to get them upset if you say someone's not authoritative. Like
I know.
Or do you have a domain of which you say they're authoritative for X, and that is our focus?
It's a great question, and I was being provocative in the way I said that.
Yeah.
Answer to the question.
It's good. Right? It's a good one to talk about.
So the answer is sort of yes. We need to think about how we recognize them, right? In what ways do we recognize them? They are a source of value in the sort of confidence checks that we do when we're doing any transactions. You know, if they've got an LEI and Glyph has approved them and so on, then well, that makes them better than way better than an unknown, right? And there's a whole bunch of things that are good about Glyph. So what I'm being is very kind of strict in my my terminology, and there is a definitions that we've got in this project around sort of what things are. If we strictly, because we are a UN body, think about countries and nation states, then we strictly think about the registrars of those nation states, then in a sense Glyph doesn't fit into that definition, but it provides useful value. And there's a number of ways in which Glyph and registrars can very much interoperate and add value even at the level we see. One of them, and I know this is happening, is the Spanish registrar, registradores, is considering becoming an LOU and or a QVI. That's the terminology used by Glyph to say you can issue LEIs and you can issue VLIs. That would mean that in our little diagram you can see here, the kind of orangey color thing and the blue color thing become kind of the same in Spain. And that would mean, but that doesn't change our table, our directory. It says in Spain, the official register is registradores. What it changes is, and they publish their identifiers in these forms. They publish them as Glyph, LEI, VLIs. They publish them as whatever they have in Spain. And the same can be true for, I know that what with say IRA, that if there's a use by the registered authority of IRA and other things, or recognition, then we can note that. It can be part of the published information that's provided. But the kind of cardinal kind of lookup is country, register, whatever thing, and that then you go to this sort of more columns to the right, if you like, of data that say other things about what that country does or recognizes. So that's sort of probably answered a few more than question 2 there, but I'm actually, I suppose, going to how might we recognize how others recognize glyph. It's kind of this idea that, well, if they use glyph and it's part of the, they could even make it part of their legal infrastructure, we can recognize that in the table of the directory thing we published, that actually in Spain, an LEI and a VLI is a legal kind of currency representation of the identifier recognized by Spain. So I'm kind of going to this idea on 4 of 4B. It's because I think there's a way of actually adding mutual value and recognition, but we don't need to consider them in the same, they're not the same type of thing in our list, but there's a way of recognizing.
John, Paul's got his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Paul, I'm not looking at my screen very well.
That's okay.
Thanks.
That's fine. I mean, one of the things that I think, how I look at this, and I've been on some of Mark's calls with ANCR, so I know where Mark's coming from as well. But I think you've probably got the problem of, it's actually a resolution problem. I need to know who CEFACT is at a global level. And so what's the authoritative register for CEFACT? Oh, it's Australia. Oh, therefore it's ASIC. And then in terms of, that's going to be used, or could be used, in a number of ways. It could be used for trade. And that's why I think the trade example is so useful, because it's like, I might need, if I'm doing a trade in Australia, I might need to know Chinese, I might need to know Chinese company, UK bank, you know, whatever. There's going to be a whole bunch of resolution in different jurisdictions that I'm going to need about. And indeed, to your point earlier, you know, there might be the ASIC, which is the definitive or primary, and I think primary and secondary was mentioned in the chat. I think that's a really useful designation, because I would consider ASIC to be primary and Bloomberg to be secondary, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
And I think, just to clarify where Mark's coming from, once you know the organization, well, you know, you can then add the privacy, you know, details on, but that's probably a different, that's an extension from the core CEFACT entry in ASIC, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
And so you might well have a CEFACT entry, or multiple entries, primary and secondary, and then you may have privacy information or ANCR information in Mark's terms, and you might have, if they're involved in trade, you might have a second credential around their trade information. I suppose where I'm coming from is the discussions that I know certainly in Australia is having, but I'm sort of seeing it in some of the other jurisdictions like Europe as well. There's a fundamental problem of resolving at a global level a digital credential for an organization, an identifier for an organization, and how to resolve that at a global level for multiple use cases, not just trade.
And Paul, that's in a sense, worryingly enough, is the problem we're trying to solve here a little. At least move towards a better resolution of that problem. The first step, we think, is this idea of a genuinely authoritative list of authoritative registrars. So, if I go to the sort of repeatable pattern and number 6 sort of questions on this list, I think there's and the way I've drawn the diagram in the slide in front of you right now, I've kind of drawn an alignment, sort of deliberately clunky, but alignment of the two concepts. On the right-hand side of this diagram is the way we've represented the logical model for GTR. and you'll see I've aligned the sort of trade participants and the registered authorities in the same sort of vertical, horizontal. What the differences are is that if we follow the path we think we're following so far, the entries inside that wonderfully UN colored circle are both constrained in the sense they need to meet some entry criteria. You are a country, you have a legal infrastructure, and this is the registrar you have anointed to do companies or land or other things that's supply chain. The next thing is we will look for those members of that directory to maintain the currency of their own data. And that's a sort of step forward, but it's basically looking at UN CEFACT is not a heavyweight, largely funded organization. It's kind of lightweight, right? So it doesn't want to either put a burden on others or on itself, but it would operate like the ICAO PKD system for passports. So that the countries are responsible for updating the public keys that they use for passports through the ICAO PKD system, but ICAO PKD is the kind of curator, if you like, for that data. So that's the kind of way we think it would work for the directory of trusted registrars or registrars that are operating in each country. By the way, if you choose to trust them, it's up to you. We shouldn't use the word trusted too blithely. And that could be used by Glyph for its purposes in terms of cross-checking and cross-washing and other things on their authoritative registration list that they maintain. So I kind of feel we'll probably have to think about each entry on its own terms, but there's a sort of pattern where I can see, if you like, imagine a table where what we're really deciding is Glyph a row in the table, one of the authoritative registrars, or is Glyph a kind of column in the table that it's one of the things that authoritative registrars recognize or use? And that idea of is it a row or a column, you could take to other things like IRA, like GS1, like whatever, right? You could imagine how it's interesting to think about how existing trust frameworks interoperate with these country level things, and you form this matrix, if you like, of data. So that's sort of where we got to kind of last night. This slide that I've showed you is a new thing from last night. We didn't have that yesterday, but it kind of goes to this discussion that says certain parties are operating under rules of a jurisdiction, under the laws of a jurisdiction, whereas Glyph is operating under its sort of governance framework, and it's a different type of thinking, these two things. And that's it. So I try and finish these at 10 minutes to the hour. We're at 10 minutes to the hour. It's been a great conversation. Again, I got a ton of sort of notes to work through, I'm sure. I encourage you, if you're interested, that this slide deck is publicly available, as are all the others. But you'll see there's a whole bunch of other kind of content. This is the set that we walk through the digital identity anchor and what it means and how it works. So this is, I hope, a fairly simple to sort of learn yourself, kind of walk through process to sort of see how that thinking evolved to become this digital identity anchor. So I'd encourage you to go kind of through those slides. I'd also encourage you to kind of reach out and add questions and challenges to us. We will hold these meetings every 2 weeks, but we're quite happy to have ad hoc special discussions or whatever in the meantime. There's a group email list, groups.io email list for the project. There's a Slack channel, and all are welcome to join both. And I think that's about it from me. Any other questions? Is there anything I need to pay attention to in the chat?
No, there've been some good discussions in the chat. I think it's really interesting to see Mark's work with Kentaro sort of and some of the standards that are sort of starting to evolve. I think we're obviously, from what you said, John, and I totally agree with it. You know, the GTR is really just starting to pull together, if you like, a directory of registries. It's not trying to impose sort of standards or approaches to interoperability at this point in time. It's just trying to sort of coordinate the recognition, if you like, of nation-state registries. But how that works, it's sort of it's up to Glyph manages its scope of responsibility, and they don't get used for things that they're not supposed to be used for. So they have to actually sort of agree that they're going to be used for over-the-counter, derivatives trading or something like that, which is what they use for in Australia. And you know, it's not that Life recognizes it, it's the financial institution body or whatever it is that's using Life that actually decides what they're used for, not Life itself. You know, so they can't impose themselves on other people. So it's interesting to see the coordination, collaboration between various different registries and registry organizations, and IRA is certainly one that very much support the promotion of and the coordination of these sort of types of activities. So it's great to see it happening, and I hope that sort of helps frame what GTR is and what GTR isn't.
And Paul, you have last question from New York.
Yeah, sorry to be a pain. But I mean, the thing I'd like to point out is that there's active discussions at the moment in, well, a good example would be Europe with their digital identity. They're trying to work out, well, what are the various, how do they digitally trust an organization identity?
Mm-hmm.
And what's sort of interesting is that, and the same discussions are going on in the US and the UK, US and Australia at the moment, and I'm sure other countries as well. But it seems that each country is determining, even in the EU framework, they're determining, well, Italy, for example, is using OpenID Federation and X509 certificates for Italy, but other jurisdictions are using other trust mechanisms. And so one of the things that's sort of an interesting overlap here is everybody's trying to work out, well, okay, how do I know that if I've got a organization that's then digitally interacting, could be trade or could be for identity or could be for something else. Ultimately, what's that trust anchor?
So,
and in different scenarios,
you're
they're
right,
using
and I think
different technologies, but it all comes
I
back
think
to
that's going to continue.
jurisdiction.
Yeah, it's going to continue, Paul. I think the much though we might all like a simple life, the reality is that there's going to be diversity, and that's probably a good thing across a number of different planes, and therefore countries will do their own thing. And what we're going to try to do with this project is to recognize what they do, which is a strange expression, but they're going to so if they use X509 certificates and other things in Italy, well, great, let's recognize that in this trusted list of things. If they use another kind of trust structure, well, let's recognize that. So in other words, if you were the recipient of a claim from a company that says that I'm based in Italy and here's my 18013-5 thing on my MDoc, and you go, well, hang on, that's not quite what I expected to see from Spain. That doesn't make, in other words, you have multiple ways of cross-checking to see whether that makes sense. And eventually it might be that this list, this is, by the way, this list you're seeing at the moment is drawn by a deep research AI sort of search across countries as to what they currently use in terms of registration and the legal basis and a bunch of other things. But this is like an example of what you might imagine the table looks like. So on the far right is what kind of digital access, what kind of verification do you provide? And it's going to vary. We might make recommendations about the general type of things you should issue digitally. They should be verifiable. They should be tamper evident. There should be a bunch of things that are obvious about them. But the recommendation, which is all that will come out of this project, will be along those lines and won't tell you, it'll probably recommend you use a standard and don't roll your own. But it doesn't need to say the world needs to move to this, because I don't think that's likely. Open trade and other things will tend to make the de facto standards evolve and emerge, and we don't need to. We have no authority to make a de jure, a legal sort of imposition across all countries that you must do this. It's not the way.
Yeah, and I think the value is the resolution of that at a global level and the ability to find or discover that information. And I think the other bit that's sort of useful as well is it's the resolution, and then it's no, it's gone. Sorry.
Right. all right. I'm sure we'll come back. Okay, I am going to call a close because I know a number of people whose business day it is starting in Australia will be looking to the next meeting at the top of the hour. So I'll give you a couple of minutes at least to get to that. Thank you all very much for your participation, attendance. Been fabulous, and I'll hope to see you on the next one 2 weeks' time. Okay.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a good one.
See you.
Thank you. Cheers, guys.